Hello.
To who can't join us live over Zoom, but do come in afterwards and watch it on the website.
Great, thanks.
First
Care,
question,
Matt, thank you.
Is that a PRS behind you?
Yeah, I knew that we were going to have a conversation. I want to talk to you about the ones behind you. I like the Explorer.
My PRS goes right in this slot right here.
See, usually I'm the only one who has guitars in the background. So then I've been, but yeah, that is the. I say to my whenever this comes up that I curated my background carefully to make me look more interesting than I am. This really is just like a little bonus room in the basement when pandemic hit. My wife's a clinical psychologist, so she got the only other room in the house that had a locked door, so my son couldn't crash into it. So I then made the basement look cooler than it is. But yes, so welcome to my basement.
And Noah, you get muted.
Yeah, thanks.
We could talk later. We could do a question and answer later. I'm very happy to talk about that. Let's see. So let's see if I can do this right. Am I sharing? Let's see. Does that share? Can you see? Are you seeing Rabbinic drinking? Are you seeing that?
Yeah, we got it now.
Okay. So this is the. I do that. Good. I think you can see that now, nice and full, right on the screen. Okay, good.
Looks good.
Okay. So and how long do you want me to talk about? I mean, you can stop me at any point. I'll just keep talking. So
we scheduled this, 45 minutes or so for you to talk, and then time for Q&A and discussion.
Perfect. So I'll, but also jump in as you go. In figuring out what to talk about for this, I was going back and forth, but I decided that that in our first discussions, Elliot mentioned my book. The point of this book, and I'll talk more about it, is to be an introductory book to themes in rabbinic literature. And it's designed, I teach college courses at a secular state university, and I'm always trying to convince students that the Talmud is the best literature to read. And I feel like this audience, it's an easier pitch for that, right? But I'm trying to explain to them why I do what I do and why I really think that. And alcohol became one way to talk about it, but it's also more than just alcohol for drinks, but particularly I found that undergrads are very happy to spend classes talking about alcohol and get credit for it. So instead of sort of pitching this more like a shiur and a source sheet, I decided to actually pitch it more like I would in the more public humanities or college class thing, because I figured that actually that might give a little different vibe than some of the normal talks you give, but I'm always happy to switch registers. So, and in that I'm always careful. So I'm going to not presume as much knowledge, but jump in and ask things as they come, because it's hard to always figure out where. So what I often start with students with is the Hebrew Bible. Like Tanakh, we'll talk about that you can't kindle a fire on the Sabbath, but it doesn't say if you can fire up an Amazon Kindle on the Sabbath, right? And how do you get there? How do you go from a biblical principle to the technology of the world around you? And so I'm trying to explain to them how you get there. And I'm someone who I prefer Talmud. I'm not a medievalist for a reason. I think that codes, once you hit them, I'm not as interested in that, because I love the Talmud that's so open-ended. And then I have friends who are medievalists, but I dislike when you get to the medieval times and you suddenly get the codes that say, okay, instead of all these random things about Shabbat, what are the 3 things that I need to know about Shabbat and what? Okay, so there's a big debate. What do I actually have to do? I'm less interested in that. I'm interested in the debates that are teasing out principles for things. And so when going to answer the question of can you fire up an Amazon Kindle on Shabbat, right? You have to work out a series of principles. And those beginnings of how you figure out those principles get articulated in classical rabbinic literature and Mishnah, Tosefta, Talmud. And those are the texts that most interest me. Now, I Googled image search for I love Talmud. And of them, this is the one that I like the most, simply because part of also what this book is again, I said, I'm excited about this in ways that I remember walking home from work one day with my wife, talking about something I was researching, and she stopped and patted me in the arm and said, "It's a good thing that you love the rabbis," which was her way of saying, like, I get it, you're excited about this, but we can talk about something else, right? Like it was an esoteric thing that I was super excited about. But honestly, this is something that I do think about when I, lie down at night, when I wake up in the morning, kind of thing. And so part of this project is to communicate that excitement. And one of the ways I'm trying to communicate it is that's different than the group I'm presuming today, right? Is to people who may or may not be intrinsically interested in this literature, right? But I still think there's value for this, whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, whether you're planning to go to rabbinical school or going to be a chemical engineer, right? And so part of what I'm trying to do in this whole project is justify my love for the Talmud, right? So this is a picture of the book. I'm very proud of this cover. We were talking about covers. The suggestion I gave to them was actually perfectly about Passover. The idea, you could admit that I see that they were talking about book cover ideas, and I told them about the tradition of 4 cups of wine on Passover. So if you look carefully, you see there are 4 glass, and I told them about the idea of wine stains on a tablecloth. And this was one of they did, I think, a beautiful job for this. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't say that I just checked. And if you go on Amazon, you could, for free shipping, get it in time for Chol HaMoed, or pay a little extra and get it right before Pesach begins. But I figured because when I started preparing this talk, I realized how close we are to Passover, which gave me a panic attack. And then, so it was good because time feels like it has no meaning these days, right? And yet that was a great way of reminding me. I knew that Passover was soon. I didn't realize how soon. But so I thought we'd focus on texts about Passover. And I consciously tried to use some of the ones that maybe some will be familiar, but some won't be, because I also like the idea of talking about some things that maybe will be relevant, but also that will be relevant, but also that are maybe not the most obvious first ones to come to, or that might start off in obvious first ones and veer in another direction. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about is the logic behind this text. And again, explaining why the thing that I find most fascinating about Talmud text, the reason why, although it's wonderful to have the source sheets that go about what's the halacha of this and that and how to apply it, the legal reasoning, the parsing into categories, the reading of text. As I'm always saying to students, I have become a better reader of texts because of Talmud. I'm great in administrative meetings when we're coming up with an annoying faculty policy because of Talmud, to be able to say, well, do we want to allow this to be read this way, or do we want to prevent it to be read this way? And I can do that because of having studied Talmud, and I love that for that sake. And so, so what I'm also going to be focusing on is how you get to that. And so these are also some of the favorites that I found that relate to Passover in this research. So again, jump in as questions come up, but then I'm not clicking on this. Let's see. I should know technology by now. Okay, here we'll go back. Okay, so first I want to discuss the concept of straining wine and brewing beer on Chol HaMoed, on intermediate festival days. And actually, this is cool. The Palma, there's become a rise of, as it says, kosher for Passover beer. Right, and it's a rise in Israel. It's also come about in America a lot because of gluten-free issues, and there's a nice interaction with it. This is a great advertisement. I saw it. It has a red and clear alcohol with a light body, a fruity aroma, and light bitterness, right? And so it sounds like a lovely beer you'd want to sit and drink. And then this is an awesome old Sukkot photo I found. And we'll talk about, and I have Passover and Sukkot here because we're talking about Chol HaMoed, the intermediate festival days. Those really apply to Passover and Sukkot. And I won't get too into it right now. I will say that the point of this project that it comes from was introducing themes in rabbinic literature. And my argument was you can use beverages, particularly alcohol, to introduce all the major themes in rabbinic literature. For example, holidays. So this is one example. To talk about this, I have to teach you what intermediate festival days are, what Passover is, what Sukkot is, what all these rules are, and to answer these questions, you have to learn all this information. So it becomes a nice gateway to it. And if I say to students, although I won't talk about this text today, one of my favorite texts that I love to teach was, I can say, I'm going to teach you about ritual purity and impurity about water. Or I can say to you, and there's this text in the mission that talks about it, do you want to learn the rules of what happens when your drunk friend pushes you into a river? And they'll say the second, right? But then I say, okay, well, to understand that, you have to understand ritual purity and impurity with regard to liquids. So this becomes my gateway to talk about things. So let's look at a text that starts with Mishnah Shabbat 21. And I found it hard to have English and Hebrew up on screens with screen share and Zoom. But like, for example, if you have a phone available, you have like Safari as a great resource. You can easily, if you want to find the Hebrew Aramaic, it's super easy to find. And we're happy to talk about it too. So we're going to start with Mishnah Shabbat 21. Rabbi Eliezer says, one may suspend a strainer on a festival day, but not on the Sabbath. And one may put wine through a strainer on the Sabbath and thus also on a festival day. So we're going to stop there for a second. Wine, like you can, your nice $9.99 Binny's wine will not have too much dreck in it, like dregs and junk. But ancient wine had a lot of stuff in it. And you'd want to put a strainer and pour wine through it so that you had wine without junk in it. And our question, of course, is, can you do it on Shabbat? What if you set it up before Shabbat? What about a festival? What about a normal day? So the first, they say you can suspend a strainer. You can set up in a festival day, but not on Shabbat. But you can put wine through a strainer on Shabbat, so also on a festival day. Okay, but the sages say, so now we're going to slow our roll for a second. One may neither suspend a strainer on a festival day nor put wine through it on a Shabbat, but one may put wine through a strainer on a festival day. So the sages say, no. Let's back it up a bit. What you really can do is, if you've set up a strainer, you can use it on a festival day, but not on Shabbat. So so in the book project, I use this also to talk about rules about Shabbat, rules about festival days, or so Chagim, and then rules about Chol HaMoed, about intermediate festival days. But the main thing you have to understand for this, and then we're going to get to what I think is one of the cooler passages that that we can discuss, is that there's a debate of you have wine that you want to drink. Wine has junk in it. You want to get that junk out and drink nice wine. There's an understanding that you need wine for ritual and enjoyment purposes. And so you need to have it and you don't want junk in it. But how do you get that? So that's the basis. Now let's look a little bit more. And we're going to have three issues that come up that are interesting. One is this concept of a subterfuge, a trick, a way to get a desired result that is technically allowed, but it's a wink. And the reason as we get into this, I see one of the things, again, that I'm always trying to convince students about is that these texts can be pious, but also smirk as they're being pious. They can enjoy the fact that it's getting around the law, but it's a legal way to get around the law. We're going to talk about beer now, because texts written in Israel are wine culture. They're influenced by Roman culture. But if texts written in Bavel and Babylonia are texts that are written in a beer drinking Babylonian Sasanian culture. So there's a lot of questions that come up in the Babylonian Talmud that say, okay, you talk about wine, but what about beer? In fact, and we can talk more about, I bit my tongue when he was giving his Nesach, his libation wine explanation before, but that is an issue only for wine. It's not for beer. So the Babylonian Talmud will ask, so what about beer? And some fascinating things come up. So let's continue into Bavli Shabbat 139b is asking questions about the text from the Mishnah. Yes.
Can I just ask a quick question? What is the Hebrew word that you translate as subterfuge?
Subterfuge, I believe it's maramarim, like meaning like a tricky thing.
Yeah.
So Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said, one may employ a subterfuge with regard to suspending a strainer on a festival day. So you can do a trick by using it to hold pomegranates in it. And then once it is already set up, pour wine through it and hold sedum in it. So I imagine this like, if you've ever seen a foldable strainer, you set it up, you say, look, it's a pomegranate holder. Well, now I have my pomegranate holder set up. Well, look, it has some holes in it. I guess I'll just pour some wine through it. See, I didn't set up a strainer for my wine. I set up a pomegranate holder. But this is actually why what Rav Ashi now says is really important, provided that he holds pomegranate in it first. So you can't say this is a pomegranate strainer until it holds pomegranates, right? But notice what he's saying. So if I set up a strainer for wine on a festival day, poured wine through it, I've violated halakha. Simple. If I set up a pomegranate holder, put a pomegranate in it, count, to 3 Mississippi, lift it up, take it out, and pour wine through it, I'm just using my pomegranate strainer in another way. Pomegranate holder, sorry, in another way. And this is for anyone who spent any time studying halakha, it's all about categorization, right? Does it violate law or not? Now, I'm also with my students, I'm very conscious of this because I want them also to understand what comes a medieval and modern and to this day anti-Semitic stereotype, right, of the legalistic Jew. And what I'm trying to get them to say, that is a later external problematic view. When you're looking at these texts, you have to view it as this is a group that firmly believed, right, that you must follow halakha. And it's a binary in many ways, right? Do you follow God's will or do you not? And so to violate Shabbat is gravely serious. But the question is what constitutes a violation? And so in this case, right, if you didn't put your pomegranates in it, you violated. But once you do that, it's frozen in a different category. So there's two things. One is the pious reading of this is to say that they're actually trying to make sure they don't violate rabbinic law and halakha in general, right? Torah law, rabbinic law, etc. But the other thing is it also the debate and teasing out is also fun, right? They didn't have Netflix, I'll say to my students, but also it can be serious fun too. And so part of understanding this is the playfulness of these texts, but also the fact that bracketing out that anti-Semitic stereotype, because it is deeply problematic, I have to call it out. But I also want students to understand that that's not what they're doing. They're trying to figure out categories, like all legal systems are, and figure out, because it matters if you violate this law, right? And that's why they're teasing out these categories. So if you don't establish it as a pomegranate holder, then you are violating halakha. So again, but this is also the reasons that I love this literature. Like they're catching things like Rav Ashi's point is a really smart legalistic catch, right? And again, I'm trying to teach my students how to think better. And when I first really worked through this text, like that was a catch that I'm like, you caught an angle that I might have missed. And because of that, the law is clear, but my ability to reason is also clearer. So continuing on for this text, so it's continuing on with 139b in Bava Shabbat. There's also a parallel with Moed Katan, 12b. So how is this case in regard to straining wine different from that which is taught in a Baraita? Right, a Baraita is a text quoted in Talmud that is reputed to be from a Talmudic source, so from Mishnah or Tosefta or something. I say reputed because some of them are clearly from there, others are not, but we can talk about that another time if anyone's interested. One may brew beer on the intermediate days of the festival. So now we're switching to beer, the question, and again, this is a concern of the Babylonian Talmud. It's, I don't know how things are down in Illinois, but in Wisconsin, beer is very important. So I find it very easy to explain to my students why the Bavli is interested in beer. One may brew beer on the intermediate days of the festival when it's necessary for drinking on the festival, right? So you have these, I call it like the hole in the middle of the donut that defines the donut, right? You have the Chagim, then you got these intermediate days, and then you got Chagim again. And so the question is, these are like festival-ish, right? They're things that they're not quite festival, but they're not festival. And so the question is what can you or can't you do on those? So they say you can brew beer on those days. So in case you're wondering, if you're a home brewer, you can brew beer in the middle of those. But the idea, don't think of beer the way today where it can be in a can and last for a long time. It needed to be drank fairly quickly. It didn't store the same. It's why also beer was cheaper than wine. Wine could store a little bit longer. Beer you could brew all year round. Right? Grapes have a specific season. You can just as long as you keep grain dry, you can brew beer regularly throughout the year, regardless of growing season. So it's not necessary for this drinking on the festival. Then it's forbidden. So you can brew beer on the intermediate days for a chag, for festival, as long as it's necessary for that. But if it's not, like if you have tons of beer ready to go, you can't do it. So this ruling applies both to date beer and barley beer. Now, why does it bring up date beer and barley beer? Well, think about barley as a problem for Passover, right? And date beer, right? Number one is okay for Passover, but think of if you're thinking of for Sukkot, right? The date from the lulav, and so there's a connection there. So it's not incidental that they're bringing up, although date beer was the most common beer at that time. Barley beer was also fairly common. They're bringing up beers that have direct connections to these holidays. And in the book, I tease out more about that because I'm assuming there's a decent knowledge of Sukkot and Pesach and Passover in this audience, but I'm happy to answer questions about those as well. So those are not incidental. So even though one has old beer available, one may employ, here's our trick again. You can use a subterfuge, and drink from newly fresh beer. So you can say, even though you have some, you can do it. So now, Why is that? How is that? Well, I'm going to use the conclusion to bring that back. There, in regard to beer, the matter is not apparent. So you can say, oh, I'm brewing beer because I don't have any, but I don't know. I can't see what beer you have in your stock, right? So you can do it and claim it. But wine, you need to establish it because it's more apparent, because I can see, did you set up that strainer or not? But again, with both, the key thing here too is they're acknowledging that this is a trick, but it's a legal trick. And that really matters because, again, the question is, did you violate halakha or not? The answer is no, this doesn't violate halakha. Now, it might violate the spirit of it, but that is allowable in this. And again, part of that teasing out in the play, for the other thing I'm also trying to convince my students that hopefully this audience would probably be more attuned to is that there's a playfulness to this text that also is why when students see these as boring legalistic, it's like you're not reading the tax. There are some pages of the Talmud that do read probably like the tax code, unless there's someone here who loves reading the tax code. But there are many where imagine if you were in the middle of the tax code and then they go off on a long, funny joke. And so what I'm also trying to, like, there's an acknowledgement of that, but there's also an acknowledgement that there's some playfulness here. So is that clear so far? Any questions on that before I move on? Because then I want to turn more. Okay, I have it. So I'll still allow for a second. So now I want to do some text about 4 cups of wine and alcohol at the Passover Seder. Because actually, this is a problem because rabbis in general are not fans of drinking to excess. And drinking to excess, so binge drinking for the rabbis would be 1 glass of undiluted wine, because mine was mixed, 3 parts water, 1 part wine. So either 1 undiluted glass or 4 diluted glasses, which means Passover is the definition of binge drinking in 4 cups. And also, particularly in Babylonian Talmud, there's concerns of drinking pairs, drinking even numbers of alcohol. So you have 2 problems for the rabbis. So let's look a little bit more into this. So first, we're going to start with Mishnah Pesachim, chapter 10. If you've never read chapter 10 of Mishnah Pesachim, the tractate of Passover, it's a great primer right before the Seder. A lot of the Seder comes from this chapter with some fascinating changes in ways. And for anyone who's doing Daf Yomi, we just finished the order of Pesachim. So some of the texts that we're going to talk about today, you might have just recently read. So on the eve of Passover, close to the time of Mincha, a person should not eat until it becomes dark. So when it's getting close to dark, stop eating. And even the poorest person in Israel should not eat until he reclines. And they should not give him fewer than 4 cups of wine, even if the wine comes from the soup kitchen. So even the poorest person is supposed to drink 4 cups, and it should come from the communal soup kitchen. That is a time where it's seen that everyone should have it, regardless of someone's bank account. And as it's a communal obligation, even to not just give food, but wine to the poorest of the poor at this time. Okay, so wine becomes central to this, right? The central part of the practice of the Passover Seder. But let's dig a little deeper to this. Okay, so that passage becomes the basis of a discussion in the Babylonian Talmud. So let's read that. So they should not give him fewer than 4 cups of wine. Okay, so how could our rabbis enact something whereby one person comes into danger? For it was taught, again in the Braita, a person should not eat in pairs, nor drink in pairs, nor wipe after defecation in pairs, nor have sex in pairs. So there are these concerns that things shouldn't be done in pairs. I could give a whole talk on Talmud has very detailed discussions of how to go to the bathroom too. But I find that students and audiences are much more interested in talking about wine than they are in bathroom habits. So I will stick to the script that I promised. But if you have questions about that, I'm very happy to. There's pages and pages, for example, in Brachot on this that people seem to just skip over. Rav Nachman said the biblical verse states, it was a night of guarding for the Lord bring them out of the land of Egypt, that some night is the Lord's for guarding all the children of Israel throughout their generations. Some of this might seem will become familiar to you as you return to your Passover Haggadah. So it's talking about Exodus 12:42. So this means that a night that is guarded from then on against harmful spirits. So it's using a biblical pasuk, a verse, to say, no, it's a night of guarding. So even though things shouldn't be in pairs, God is guarding people tonight. So why, how is this night different? Well, one of the ways that this night is different is God is guarding against pairs. But then it continues on, and another thing I love about the rabbis are they're just as bad about math as I am. I have given a talk on rabbinic math. Like, for example, when talking about the sukkah, they talk about pi. The concept of pi comes up, and they just basically say 3 is close enough to 3.14. So just use 3. Or the 613 mitzvot, if you look at the passage in the Bavli it comes from, it basically is they do some gematria to get up to 611, and then you add 2, and it becomes 613. And so these are, I feel like my math skills comport well with this. So the text continues on. Rava said the cup of blessing, which is the third cup that's consumed after the recitation of Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, so is called the cup of blessing. Koshel bracha in Hebrew, combines with the first 2 cups consumed prior to Passover meal for good, but does not combine for evil. So what they're doing there is they say, no, it's 3 plus 1 is not 4. So you say there's 2 cups, so it's not 2 and 2. It's the first 2 cups, then the grace after the Birkat Hamazon cup, those are 3. And then the other one is 1. So it's not 2 and 2, which are pairs, and that's a problem, or 4. It's 3. That's a nice odd number, and 1. Ravina said the rabbis enacted the requirement that we drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder as symbolic of the conduct of freedom. Each one is a mitzvah by itself, it's a commandment by itself. So it's not 3 plus 1, it's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So it's not 4, it's not 2. It's either 4 ones or 3 and a 1. But I would be remiss if I'm talking about this if I didn't add, again, my favorite. They then continue on to talk about the different ways that rabbis made sure when they were drinking that they didn't have pairs. And my favorite is there's a lot of texts about Abaye's mother in the Talmud. That's another fun thing we can talk about. But Abaye would drink 1 cup. His mother would place 2 cups in his hands. So it depicts, like, imagine Abaye at a bar drinking, and his mother is standing right next to him with 2 cups. And he finishes his 1, and his mother makes sure that she puts 2 in front of him, so that so whenever he'd go to the bar, his mother would be standing there to make sure that he drank even numbers, not odd numbers, not even numbers. So this shows a concern for pairs, but is showing how this is different, right? And it's different in multiple ways. And again, this is an example of not to keep hammering away at the medievalists, right? But when you get to codes, they want to, what's the one answer? I'm very comfortable with there being 3 answers, and 3 answers that might contradict each other. Because in my mind, that expands the possibilities and is far more interesting. And I'll just say from my own theology is much more satisfying intellectually and spiritually that there are multiple possibilities than the single one definition for that, right? So the being that, it can be a night of guarding. It can be 3 and 1. It can be 1 and 1. And all of them get to the same point, right? Which is, well, this night pairs don't quite count the same way for this one thing. So questions on that, about Abaye's mother or about rabbinic math? Okay. So now we're going to continue on for another fascinating text where I get to if you're familiar with the parlance of our time, pre-gaming, right? Drinking before an event. Well, there's rabbinic pre-gaming. This is, again, another way I bring them in is I ask them if they know what pre-gaming is, and they imagine it's drinking before going to a football game. And I say, okay, well, let's learn what the rabbis say to say about pre-gaming. And when they get over the shock that there's a rabbinic discussion of pre-gaming, I have them, right? So we can talk about it. So Rava would drink wine all throughout the day on the eve of Passover. So if you want to be like Rava, you get drunk all during the day for Passover, so that he would whet his appetite in order to eat more matzah in the evening. Which I mean, I gotta say, it's a smart strategy to eat more matzah, right? Because at that point, you're like, this is delicious. Whereas if you're sober, you're like, really, 8 days of this. Okay, bring it. So Rava said, on what basis do I say that wine whets the appetite? For it's taught, between these cups, if one wants to drink, one may drink. Between the third cup and the fourth, one may not drink. So we say, okay, between the first and second cup, you can do that. But between the third and fourth, you can't. Why? Because at that point, you're done eating, right? You're supposed to, what's the third cup, the cup of blessing? What's the point of that? It's for Birkat Hamazon. The whole point of grace after meals is it's after meals, right? And so you shouldn't be eating that. So, and again, this quote's from Mishnah Pesachim 10:7. So if you say that wine satiates, one may drink additional wine between this. Why may one? So if you're saying that it fills you up, why can you keep drinking wine? Indeed, eating matzah would be gorging, would be overeating. So rather, learn from this that wine whets the appetite. So no, it gets you excited for food. It makes you want to eat more, which to me is an elaborate justification of Rava just drinking all day before the Seder. But you can read that passage however you wish. But it gets the question of drinking, celebration. And the other thing is, again, the vast majority of rabbinic texts are anti-over-drinking. But when it comes to Passover and Purim, we can talk about that as well, the traditions are a bit more complicated. But I will argue that even still, you see them pushing back a little bit, like they're a little bit looser, but they're still trying to control so that it doesn't get out of hand too much. But there's still more on this in Bavli Brachot. So they have to return, like, so does wine satiate? Does wine really fill you up? Indeed, Rava would drink all throughout the day on the eve of Passover. So it seems like this was well known, right? It appears in a couple of places that everyone knew what Rava would do. I'm not saying now everyone starts going home and drinking all day, right, before Passover and say, no, I'm just doing what Rava did. So that he would whet his appetite. Yes.
I'm sorry, excuse me. We have a question. Zev, you had a question?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, it's about the alcohol and drinking all day and the effects and stuff.
Yeah.
And this is also could lead to a big tangent. I don't know if you had a quick thing. When did grape juice come into play?
You mean like,
non-alcoholic wine?
Non-alcoholic.
Grape juice as wine, and different communities now, vary on the acceptance of lechatchila.
Right. So a few things I would say. One is in the ancient world, wine was more, and in Bavel, beer, but was most common to be drank more than water because for a variety of reasons. One is actually it's more sanitary, right, in terms of the process of making it, but it would be watered down, which actually makes it less sanitary if you think about it, but whatever. The grape juice, there's to me the most interesting grape juice story, and the part it gets much bigger is actually in modernity. So, for example, my favorite grape juice part of all of this comes in America, I bring this up because in America becomes this tradition of sweet wine, right, being kosher wine. Like it was great that you had a lovely tasting of non-Manischewitz sweet wine, right? But the reason that that sweet wine gets associated in America is because Jews immigrating to particular parts of America where the Concord grape, which is very sweet, grows. And there you'll get, and I'm getting to your question here to say this, that at that time, the temperance movement, the Christian temperance movement comes, and there's a push to have non-fermented grape products. And they first turned to Jews in this philo-Semitic, but really anti-Semitic way of, Jews don't drink. And then found out actually Jews do drink, right? So that didn't work. So they then returned to their anti-Semitic roots and pushed this away. But as part of that, they needed to get grapes for their grape juice product. And Jews were growing grapes particularly the Concord grape, because of that region, to make kosher wine. So companies like Welch's, which starts as a temperance Christian group, starts buying Jewish grapes to make to make a sweet unfermented grape juice. That then snowballs into something, which is why those sweet grapes make kosher wine that becomes very sweet wine. So people identify it as that, but also it starts to make sweet grape juice. And then there's an overlap in that sense between that sweet product, the sweet grape. So then it becomes, because of temperance society, a lot of consuming of, like, suddenly you're not, there's a, well, should you really be giving your kids wine? And so then there becomes an increase on this, and then it kind of bleeds multiple ways. So you could find little traditions here or there, but I think that a lot of that comes post that's influenced by that. But I'm not a modernist, so this is like my haphazard readings of modernity. And but from my triangulations of things, I see that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, and if there's nothing in, rabbinic literature really before the temperance movement in America, like if there's not a whole lot considering grape juice for sacramental purposes, then that's kind of a clear indication of.
Well, yeah, but I mean, on the other hand, grape juice is still, like there's, yeah, I mean, I think the thing is that, yeah, I mean, I guess, again, I can't, off the top of my head, I'm not going to say there isn't, like, for example, medieval or early modern debates about that, but I can't remember off the top of my head any. And in the little bits I looked into it, the most I seemed to find was starting with that story and continuing on. But that also might be because that's a fascinating story and more people have written about it.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's fascinating and it makes sense. And also it's, just standard. I haven't done the research, but it does not appear that older Jewish texts discuss grape juice too much. It's more kind of a modern response about, when can you have grape, what's lechatchila and what's, okay for this.
Right. So yes.
Something to this?
Yeah.
And on what you're talking about, Professor. So I know there are examples in some older Jewish texts of grape juice being mentioned, but I can't point to them directly off the top of my head, but you don't find many of them because grape juice that isn't pasteurized goes bad very quickly.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to use grape juice for the Seder, you would need to basically squeeze the grapes right before each cup, potentially, or right before the Seder. And that's a lot of work and just isn't practical. So that's probably a reason why you don't see it. You don't find pasteurized grape juice until Reverend Welch in the late 1800s, as you mentioned, when he created a process for creating non-alcoholic pasteurized grape juice specifically for Christian communion. So the Kedem grape juice that we all enjoy is a result of that process, which was created by a Christian pastor for Christian communion.
Yeah.
So you really only see it as like a viable alternative in the 1800s, late 1800s.
And I mean, you do have discussions, right, of like, grape juice, fermented or otherwise, right, that turns to vinegar, and the problems with that, and all the now that you mentioned, the things I could think of are about grape products that temperamentally turn to vinegar, and that tends to come up with regard to issues related to the handling of wine in general, and then the handling of vinegar too, and what does it extend to it or not. I'm very happy. And you mentioned that there's a great book, Jews and Booze by Marnie Davis, that talks about some of this fascinating history. There's also Kosher USA by Roger Horowitz, the single best book on the kosher history in America, that has great stories on the history of Manischewitz. And so, yeah, there's lots of things to read on that. Okay, so we'll sort of finish up this text, but keep shooting questions as they come up, because I personally find that part more interesting, the give and take of these things, because I'm spending a lot of time in my basement talking to my screen. This is one of the rare times that my screen is talking back to me. So makes me feel much more social. But does wine satiate all? And wine glads the heart of man, and bread satiates the heart of man, etc. from Psalm 104. 15. So this implies that bread satiates, but wine does not. So does it? So this is a great question of reading. It says that wine gladdens, but bread satiates. So does that mean, well, wine gladdens, but it doesn't satiate? Or does it apply? This is a great rabbinic question, right? They look at a pasuk or look at a biblical verse and say, does it matter that does one part of it talk about the first part, or are they separate things? Right. And so they said, no, this is not what it says, but rather what is it teaching is that wine is both. Wine satiates and gladdens, but bread only, it satiates, but it doesn't gladden, which I mean, I've had some nice bread, but I think people tend to be like, oh, that's wonderful. There's wine at the meal. You didn't have a bread tasting before this. Although right after Passover, right, bread is probably the most exciting thing for people. But then, this continues this is what I'm going backwards. My favorite part of this is towards the end. So if so, should we recite 3 blessings over wine? And so we should recite 3 blessings, right, over wine, because with bread, right, you have the longer version of Birkat Hamazon. So they're saying, if wine is so great, why don't you give the longer blessing because you had wine, right? If you had wine but no bread, you can have a short Birkat Hamazon. But if you had no wine but bread, you got to do the long version. So people do not make wine the basis of their meal. I'm going to leave that aside, or if you want to say they say that. Then Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says to Rava, what if one did? It's a great question. Like, people don't do that. It's a great rabbinic / smart ass question, right? Like, well, what if you did? You say they don't. What if they did? And I just love this answer. Rava said, when Elijah comes, he'll tell us. Right? So when we have the Messianic era, you can sit down and have a drink with Elijah and say, we've had this halakha question for a while. But until then, no. Which I love. There are a couple of these dodges in rabbinic literature, which I just love, of where they're just acknowledging, like, we're kind of at a standstill. Right now, this is the best we can do, but we're fully aware that conditions could change when Mashiach arrives. So that should be your first question. So I just love when a text gets to that point, because also it's a moment to think about, like, understanding that the limits of human knowledge at a specific time, while also still allowing that details might change, right? Information might change. And when that does, you can reevaluate it. But at this moment, there's that. So we're about 45 minutes. I could talk about more text, or I could answer questions. I always put more in a PowerPoint than I need, because I never know if things go quick, or if someone asks a question, I can switch gears. So there are specific questions about anything, or?
Let's go a little further, and then we can take a break and open it up.
Okay, so I could keep going. Let's see what I have next. Okay, still talking about 4 cups. So why is it prohibited to drink between the 3rd and 4th cups? So we saw that before, right? You can drink for the first 3, but then you got to stop. So that one does not become intoxicated. Let's forget about Rava drinking all day, right? But then they ask the great question, but aren't you already intoxicated? Like, you've been drinking all meal. Now suddenly it's going to be too much. So what's the difference between wine drunk during the meal and wine drunk after the meal? Wine drunk after the meal causes intoxication, but wine drunk during the meal does not cause intoxication. Now, this is, I don't think this is scientifically accurate in that sense. Like, you don't want to go test this to say, like, no, I can drink as much as I want during a meal. It's not going to get me drunk. But if I have a little extra after, not. But I do think what they're getting at is, instead of thinking literal intoxication, you should think about the idea of, as I said, they're allowing for more drinking here, which is beyond what they usually do. So Passover allows for, halakhically obligates to do the definition of rabbinic binge drinking, right? But they're saying there are allowances for that, and that's during the meal. But if you do it after that, then at that point it's excessive. So there's controlled excess in a sense. And the reason I also bring this up is thinking about, with Passover coming, the punctuation of the meal and how the meal operates. And as someone who studies food, Passover is one of my favorite things to discuss because it's a home-based ritual that every element is around food, right? Food is the entire metaphor for and physical representation of what's happening at the Seder. And so wine punctuates that meal. And after that, so allowing the drinking during is yes, excessive, but it's allowed because it's part of that. Once you hit that third cup, you've now switched gears. And that's why they'll say, no, that would lead to intoxication, because at that point, you're drinking beyond the bounds of what was the sort of controlled revelry of it. And now you're out of bounds for that.
So is it the sense that maybe it could be read as wine drunk during the meal is not for the purpose of intoxication, whereas once the meal is over, then really you're just drinking in order to become intoxicated, which is clearly beyond the boundaries of
yes.
what will be permissible.
Yeah, 100%. And because then there's clearly a goal for that and the goal is just to keep drinking, rather than to be part of the social atmosphere, rather than to eat more, rather to enjoy the meal. And also because at that point, you're also supposed to be, think about the liturgy of the Seder, right? At that point, you're supposed to be thinking of different things rather than the revelry of the meal, rather than the excitement of that. You're switching gears liturgically. And and so at that point, if you're drinking, yes, you're beyond the bound, you're drinking to get drunk. I should say there's just water in this.
I'm sorry we couldn't send you the wines that we had earlier. Well, this is extremely interesting. I don't want to overburden, but let's open it up to the floor. I think there are a lot of interesting themes and concepts here. To what extent, though, in terms of the playfulness that you were describing earlier, some of the approaches and the views of it, are there any indications in the text that they have any self-awareness of what they're doing, or is it just comes across through the text that way?
Oh, they have. There are many times that they have. From the acknowledging the whole subterfuge, there are many times that they wink and nod about that. That there's no fourth wall in that sense, right? So yeah, they're very well aware of that, but also they're assuming that everyone is in on that, right? So their audience is understanding it, and so it's the playfulness that comes from familiarity, right? And so yeah, there. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. There are tons of examples of this where they're. I have an article I wrote about. There's some fascinating texts where rabbis change the subject, right? Where like someone is pushing them on a legal question, and they literally change the subject. There's one where someone does this, and his son pulls him aside afterwards and said, "Dad, how can you do that?" And his answer was, I knew the answer, but I was hungry and tired and didn't feel like going into it. And on the one hand, you could say that's ridiculous, but on the other hand, actually, like there's a certain playfulness there that if to read these texts, you have to accept the premise, right, of the idea being that the group involved in this text firmly believe in what they're doing, and they can be playful because of that, because they're not questioning that underlying belief. That for my students sometimes is hard to see. I taught one text of a student and there was a student in my class who had, he became from yesterday, and he was like white knuckling it, just becoming, and there was a funny text teaching, and he finally was struggling, you could tell. He finally asked, he said, "Is it okay if I laugh at this joke?" And I had to explain to him, that's the point of this text. For those, it was the text in Sifra Numbers of the student who goes to visit a prostitute, and his tzitzit slap him in the face and prevent him from doing that. And then she ends up converting and marrying him. And it's a text that's designed to be ridiculously over the top schmaltzy humor. And it's all of it is a midrash, right, on the Shema and why it repeats, "I'm the Lord your God" twice. And but he didn't know how to square that until he realized that you could so yes, there's a lot of breaking down of that. And that is I would argue, is a key feature of rabbinic literature that, and if you miss that, you're missing what the rabbis are doing, right? Because you can laugh and still learn. Right? And in fact, that helps you. And then it helps ease a tension, what might be a textual tension. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Two other questions that came in on the chat. I'll just read them out. Did the rabbis desire for there to be excessive drinking on Passover, or did they feel compelled to have 4 cups of wine because of the 4 languages of redemption?
Okay. Well, I'm in general, so did the rabbis, so I would say it's hard to generically all of them, right? Because as you're seeing, there's debates within that. I think what you're getting at, what I would say is, in general in rabbinic literature, there's a importance of 4 cups because it's a tradition they have, but a discomfort with various issues with it, whether it's binge drinking, whether it's even numbers, what I would say is that there's a series of discomforts that different rabbis have and that different rabbis try and resolve in different ways. And this is why I would compare it in some ways to some traditions about Purim too, where there's a tradition that allows things that there's a tension that concerns them. And so different rabbis some rabbis don't have a problem with it, but if you look at many texts, you start to see that there's a concern about it. And for a variety of reasons, it seems that the idea of there being 4 cups isn't really questioned. But once you accept that there are a series of potential problems and the fact that they go to such lengths to explain those away highlights the importance that they have of a tradition of 4 cups. Because there's no one that I can think of that says, well, then get rid of one of the cups. Right? An easier thing would say, well, just make it 1 cup. Then it's not an even number and it's not too much. But no one does that I've read. Does that get to that question?
Yeah. Next question. So the Seder is often compared to a Hellenistic symposium. How does the incorporation of drinking fit into the symposium type model?
So that's great. Okay. I'm a huge fan of the comparison with the symposium. There was a branch of scholarship that had problems with that. I think that's completely wrong. I think it is very much part of the symposium culture. It was a broader culture for things, but the rabbis had a very different take on it. So for example, and you see this with the term afikomen, is from a Greek term with the symposium culture, but the way the rabbis understand it is completely different. I'm happy to talk about what afikomen is in Greek culture, but we'll leave that aside for a second to say, let's think about the symposium culture that comes into the Seder. You see this with reclining at the meal, because symposium is a rich culture where, and the idea of reclining is, if you recline, you're leaning on your left elbow, you're eating, you need to be served. So you have to be wealthy. You have to be able to have servants to do it for you. So what you can also view it as a sort of ritualized theater, to be like, well, this is how they show off ostentatious wealth and freedom. So this is how we're going to do it too. But there are different elements. Instead of having so part of a symposium is table talk. And what the rabbis will say is, right, they talk about shtuya, they talk about ridiculous, silliness, inappropriate things. They have inappropriate sexual acts and various things occurring. We talk about Torah, right? And that becomes a huge difference. So they use the connections of the symposium to take on the elements of ritualized freedom and wealth. And also the moments of rejecting are to reject one culture and highlight their values. And so I think it's actually very important to have those in comparison, because it shows how they're taking on other cultural things to express the moments of freedom and redemption, and rejecting to show important cultural and theological differences. So some people view that as how, the comparison is, what does it mean then that it's a rabbinic ritual that has Greek elements or Roman elements in it? But I actually see it as that is quite important, because it's a moment of taking on the things that highlight the Passover tradition and using the differences to highlight important theological and cultural differences of rabbinic traditions.
And so David has a follow-up question. So drinking, but not to excess, fits into that model.
Well, here, let me end the show, because I can then see the other things too, I think, right? Let me, can I see that? I should be able to. Where's this? Stop share, right? Stop share. Okay, good. So that I can see the chat thing. So what's the other question? So drinking, but not to excess. Yes. So drinking is totally allowed. But again, remember, drinking is also just it's an everyday thing. To young children drank too. Wine or beer was more common than water. But the idea is, the concern is that it not be over to excess. That was a rabbinic concern as well, is that you're not going to, you shouldn't be getting drunk constantly. So like one of the important things I like to point out when we're talking about Yain Nesach, when we're talking about libated wine, is it would be much easier if the rabbis just said, you know what? There's concern about idolatry with wine. Wine isn't kosher. You're done with wine. That would be so much easier. They choose not to. They choose to work out complicated ways around it, right? To tease out, like, this constitutes a violation, this doesn't. There's so much more work to that, but that labor indicates the importance of wine. Because again, it's like, you're talking about the sciatic nerve, right? Like, just so many places just say, you know what? We're just going to chop off that part of the cow and not eat it. It's just too difficult. Let's just not even deal with that. They don't do that with wine. And the fact that most of the tractate of Avodah Zarah and idolatry is about how to deal with wine. It would be so much easier if they didn't do that. But the fact that they do shows how valuable it was to. I mean, wine, if you think about it, gets its own blessing. Meat doesn't get its own blessing. Grapes get two blessings. Apples don't, apples or apple juice, but grapes and grape juice, different. So wine is, and that again points to the importance of it for that.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions we have. And we are also at time, and I want to be respectful of people's need to maybe get back to Pesach cleaning and preparations, as well as it getting late. I want to thank you very, very much, Professor Rosenblum, and a happy birthday to you as well. And wish you and everyone on tonight a happy Pesach and a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.